All right, let's go ahead and kick it off. Again, thanks everyone for joining the Zoom Developer Summit. You're here at the Zoom Contact Center CX Developer Overview session. Thank you all very much for joining the session. My name is Justin Steinberg. I'm a technical sales architect here at Zoom, and I help focus on everything CX. And that's me, or at least what I look like in the wintertime. I have a number of my coworkers also here on this session to help answer any Q&A that comes up, and I'll try to take a look at that as we're going through the session, try to answer any of those questions live as well. Most all of what we're going to be covering here today is features that are generally available in Zoom CX. However, one item we'll be talking about is forward-looking, and I'll make sure to call that out, and that item is subject to change as described here on this slide. So let's jump into the agenda. We have a lot that we're going to cover today. We're going to go across the whole Zoom CX platform, try to cover a lot of capabilities, go deep on some of those, and make sure that we're fairly comprehensive in all things Zoom CX for developers. So the agenda for today is, what is Zoom CX? You might be a customer and know, or you might not be familiar, so we'll highlight what Zoom CX is in general. We'll talk about what Zoom CX admins do. Some of those tasks are fairly developer related. We'll go into some of our SDKs. How can you embed Zoom CX into your applications? And then we'll turn it around and show you how you can embed your application into Zoom CX. And then we'll wrap it with a discussion on our REST APIs, webhooks, and events that you can receive a real-time stream from Zoom CX. So what is the Zoom CX platform? So Zoom CX is a handful of products, starting off first and foremost with Zoom Contact Center, which is our omni-channel CCaaS offering. It has voice capabilities, web chat, video. Pair that up with Zoom Virtual Agent, which is our conversational AI chatbot for self-service applications. You can use them together or standalone. We also have Workforce Engagement Management, which includes workforce management, the ability to schedule, forecast, make sure that you have the right number of agents staffed in your contact center at the right time. We also have quality management, which can be used to review recordings, look at speech analytics, and do scorecarding to help ensure that your contact center is performing as you want. So let's take a look at what it looks like for the contact center agent, right? So the same Zoom workplace application that you're used to using for joining Zoom meetings and webinars and this Zoom events session is also the client for the contact center agent. So if you're a contact center agent, you have the Zoom Contact Center license, you're going to see that contact center option at the top of the Zoom desktop client on Windows or Mac. Here we see the Mac client. This agent is in a web chat engagement. They're talking to Maurice Lawson. We can see the chat. We can also see Maurice's information on the right, some of which are global variables that we'll talk about throughout the session today. And I also point out that the agent is multitasking multiple chat engagements. We see a couple chat engagements that are showing up there on the left-hand side, and the agent is also on a live voice call as well. Now, we also support Zoom Contact Center in the progressive web app. So if you prefer to have your agents join in a browser, you can do that. And for customers that want to have agents embedded inside of popular CRMs, we have support for a number of popular CRM systems where agents are logging into Zoom CX inside of the CRM. So that's what it takes. That's what it looks like for the contact center agent. Let's talk about developers. So who are Zoom CX developers? Well, let's use two example use cases, right? You might be a customer of Zoom CX. You might be an internal enterprise developer, in which case you might be interested to embed Zoom CX web chat into your website, or video for that matter. You might also have your own proprietary knowledge-based systems where you want to synchronize your knowledge-based content into Zoom CX so it's available for Zoom Virtual Agent or available for the AI Expert Assist. Now, you might be on this call from a partner, whether it's professional services or ISV team. You may be wanting to embed your web application into the Zoom CX agent desktop so that Zoom Contact Center agents can use Zoom CX and also use your agent desktop or your web application. You may also be interested to embed Zoom agents into your application so you can take it both directions. And of course, we also have the APIs and events I mentioned before, where you can synchronize data from Zoom platform into your applications for whatever use cases you're thinking about or creating on top of Zoom CX. Before we go too far into the developer items, let's talk some terminology briefly for what Zoom CX is. So we use the term consumer to refer to anyone that's reaching out to the contact center. That consumer could have multiple engagements. Every time they call or start a web chat, that's going to be a new engagement. So a single consumer could have 5 or more engagements in a day if they're reaching out to the contact center often. If that engagement is routed to a human agent, that of course is going to be our agent. And the workflow logic system that we have is called the Zoom Contact Center Flow or the Zoom Virtual Agent Flow. That's going to be where all of your business intelligence, your voice IVR, your chatbot, you can configure a lot of capabilities in the flow. And we'll show some screenshots of that and walk through how you would do that here in just a moment. In a lot of our projects, we have Zoom CX admins doing a lot of tasks, and some of those tasks have developer aspects to them. And so let's talk about what we see commonly performed in many of our projects as customers are migrating or onboarding to Zoom Contact Center. First off would be the workflow configuration. As I mentioned, every voice contact center is going to have voice IVR configurations, and sometimes some of those configurations pull in third-party data. Traditionally, we would refer to that as database dips, but now more recently or modernly, we may refer to those as web service calls, right? Pulling in third-party data into that workflow so that you can create customized experiences for the people, for the consumers reaching out to your contact center. And of course, CX admins are oftentimes configuring the pre-built integrations for our popular CRM systems. They'll go through and configure those integrations as well. Let's take a look at what that workflow configuration looks like. So here is our flow editor. It's our no-code, low-code workflow builder. And I'll point out here that you can drag different widgets from the left-hand side of the flow builder onto the flow. So if you're a customer, you're very familiar with this. Every contact center platform has some version of the flow editor. It's important to create the business requirements, your time of day routing, your chatbot messages. And this is the same experience for Zoom Contact Center and for Zoom Virtual Agent. In this flow editor is where you pull in that third-party data. And there's 3 different ways to pull in the third-party data into the flow editor. We're going to walk through each of those here. Let's start off with the HTTP call widget. So this is probably our easiest way to pull in third-party data into, or external data, I should say, into the Zoom Contact Center flow. It's a simple no-code widget. You can see there on the top left, let's go ahead and get the laser pointer here. You can see on the top left of the widget, here's the widget, and here's the configuration of the widget. You have the ability to configure a URL where the widget should pull in that external data, and you can pass in variables into that URL. As a query parameter example, we have the caller ID showing up inside of 2 curly braces. From there, you can pass in request headers like the authorization request header. You can also pass in a variable here and have the actual secret be configured inside of the Zoom Contact Center admin portal in our secret variable section. Once the API request is made and we pull back that external data, you'll then be able to parse bits of the JSON response body and map them into global variables. Here you can see we're using JSON.notation to extract the preferred name from the API response, and we're storing it in a global variable. That's what this value is at the bottom. That's the syntax for our global variables. From there, once we have data in global variables, it can be used later in the flow, either for self-service applications, or you can display it to the agents and have the agents be able to see that information and have more insight into what they're dealing with. Now that's the first widget. The second way to access data in the flow is through the connector widget. You heard in the keynote the mention of the connector widget. This will be coming to Contact Center later this summer. The connector widget is a no-code widget that also pulls in external data via HTTP requests, but we're partnering with Marketplace to help facilitate this connection. Let me walk you through the 2-step process for connectors. The first is going to be to build your connector in the Marketplace. Now, after this session, there's going to be a session here on the Developer Summit dedicated just to connectors, so we'll go into more detail there. So if you're interested in this, make sure to turn into that session. But here we have built a connection between the Zoom app Marketplace and an external API. The connector supports multiple authentication options, including OAuth 2 authorization code, and the connector will help manage the access tokens and help refresh tokens so that you don't need to do it yourself. The connector in Marketplace also maps API responses into variables. Once you've built your connector in the Marketplace, then you'll add the connector widget into your Zoom Contact Center or Zoom Virtual Agent flow. And you'll see here that it's pretty simple in the flow to use it. What we're going to do in this use case is we're mapping a caller's telephone number as input to the connector. The phone number comes in here, gets passed into the Marketplace. It will make that API request, passing the phone number to the external API. And then the external API will respond, and then we'll map different bits of that response to global variables or variables in the flow. Here you can see some examples of email, first name, last name, and that's how the connector and marketplace and the ZCX flow editor works together. The third option available to flow administrators is the script widget. So the script widget is the widget that you see here, and the script widget allows you to write in your own JavaScript. And you can see an example of JavaScript here. So this provides flexibility to you to do data manipulation, iterate upon arrays and responses, and it supports multiple authentication options. You can see, we'll show here in a moment an example of configuring the authorization request header. Now the script widget, I'll point out, it executes whenever that widget is called in the flow. So you can see in this example of flow, we're doing a start widget, which is where all new engagements start. And the very first thing that happens is we do an ANY lookup. We're going to try to find that caller's telephone number in an external API. So script code that you program executes when the script widget is called. Let's compare that to the next way that you can write code, which is event scripts. So event scripts is going to be the same JavaScript code, the same syntax of code, but when the code executes is different. So with event scripts, the code will execute upon various triggers. So you can see here we have 4 triggers or 3 triggers mentioned on the slide. You'll configure the events here, and you can see the drop down with the different events. You'll actually configure it on the start widget, but when your code executes is based on what event you select. So let's look at some common events. So event started is when a call or a web chat goes into the flow. You can then run in the custom JavaScript code that you program will execute when that event happens. When an engagement answers a call, then you'll have the engagement accepted event is triggered. And if you have code associated with that event, then your code for that event will then trigger. And then the lifecycle at the very end of an engagement, once the agent completes the call, finishes their notes, selects a disposition code, and completes the wrap-up, you'll have the engagement closed event. And you can additionally write some code that runs when that event is triggered. So you can select from any of those events, use one or multiple events, depending on your requirements. Let's walk through some examples of the script code. So one popular use in scripts is to work with variables, to use get and set functions to get values from variables or set values in variables. Let's take a look at that. So here we have the var underscore get. This is a built-in function, and it's going to grab the value out of this global variable. So there's a global variable called global underscore system engagement ANY, and that variable will be automatically populated with the caller's telephone number for all voice engagements. We're going to be extracting the value out of that variable, and we'll store it in our script in a local variable called caller underscore number. From there, we might make an external API call, pass that phone number in, get a response back. Once we get that response back, we need to parse the data out of the response that we're interested in and store that variable data in variables that the flow can then use later. To do that, we'll use the built-in function global underscore var set. And the first parameter of that function is going to be the name of a global variable. You can see in this example, we're setting 3 variables. The first is a custom variable, which means you can create any number of variables that you're interested in. And the second 2 are system variables that come out of the box. The second parameter of that function is the value that you want to set into the variable. And you can see here, we're parsing API response. And of course, this would vary based on your API that you're working with. But ultimately, we're saving values in variables. And then later, they can be used either in widgets that come later in the flow, or you can display that information to the contact center agent. So that's how you work with the variables. Let's now take a look at the HTTP request that would happen in the middle between those two. So here's the HTTP request, and this is just an example. You can configure it a little bit differently since you can write code in multiple ways, but this is an example. We're crafting a URL here at the top, and you can see we're passing in that caller underscore number as a query parameter. We're then setting a configuration object, which includes a request header, and in the request header is the authorization header. And the value for the authorization header is coming from a secret called example authentic authorization, which is configured in the Zoom Contact Center web admin portal. From there, we'll make the actual request, and then you can parse the response depending on your requirements. This is an example of how to do that. And of course, you can do other HTTP methods as well, depending on what APIs you're working with. Now, other important features that you'll want to include in your scripts are logging. So you'll want to make sure that you have logging statements so that you can troubleshoot anything that comes up, whether it might be an unexpected error or something that can happen from time to time. So here you can see an example of the log statement that you can add to your script code, log.info, and then you can put in anything into that log statement that you'd like. And to see that logging data, you're going to go into your flow. You'll turn on the debug console, which in this screenshot has already been turned on. Once the debug console is running, at the bottom, you'll see all of the debug statements, some of which are generated by the system. And then any log info statements or other logging levels that you include will also be included there at the bottom. So you can see logging statements there and understand what's happening with your script. When you're developing your script, we have an easier way for you to do testing, and let's take a look at that. So we have a built-in test function that you can use while you're developing the script. So let's take a look at what it looks like when you're developing the script. So first off, here's all your code, right? This is the example code here we have in this slide showing up here. And let's take a look at a couple of the lines in particular. So line 14, line 15, we're grabbing values from variables. In line 14, we're grabbing the any variable or the caller's telephone number. And in line 15, we're grabbing the DNIS or what number did that caller dial. Now, if you're running this test locally as you're developing, of course, there's no real call and therefore there's no real values for either of those two variables. So the way that you'll handle that is on the right-hand side in the input parameter, any variables that are required as input into your code, you'll create your own JSON object there. And you can see I have the Annie and I'm passing in a sample value and the DNIS as well. Or I guess the DNIS is not required in this example, but what you can configure any required variables, click the run button, then your script code will execute and you'll see the output there at the bottom. This can help you develop your script and make sure that everything's working correctly and make it efficient as you're developing a script widget. Okay, let's talk about the SDKs available to embed Zoom CX into your applications. We'll talk about several examples here. So first off would be the Zoom CX Web SDK. If you have a website and you're a web developer, you can embed chat and video. We'll show some examples coming up. If you're a mobile app developer for iPhone or Android, you can use the CX Mobile SDK to embed Zoom CX chat and video into your mobile application. Now, the first two are targeted towards consumers, people that are using your apps. The third SDK, the Smart Embed, is targeted towards the contact center agent. So if you want the agent to be embedded inside of your web application, you can use Smart Embed to do that. We'll show an example here in a moment. And the fourth example would be to use the turnkey Zoom Room kiosk. So we're partnering with the Zoom Room team. You can put some Zoom Room hardware in a kiosk area. People can walk up and have a single button press to get connected to an agent over video. That's a turnkey solution. People that are interested in kiosks may use that, or they may build their own kiosks with either the Web SDK or the Mobile SDK. Let's walk through some examples of Web SDK, right? What does this provide for your website visitor? So here's the sample website on the top right. You can see a video button at the bottom right, a live help video button. Consumers can come up to your website, push the video call. It's automatically going to start a video call right inside the browser. The video call is going to be routed over to a contact center agent, and you can see that at the bottom left. The contact center agent is going to be handling that video call inside a contact center. So you can think of a Zoom meeting-like experience, but put it into the flow and have a queuing mechanism, logging, recording, and analytics for those video calls with a Zoom CX. We also support web chat. All of us, I'm sure, have been involved in a web chat on a website in our personal lives, and you can see an example of an active web chat here showing up on the website. And again, on the agent side, the agent is handling that inside their Zoom CX desktop. The third use case for the Web SDK is going to be scheduled callback. So in scheduled callback, somebody's going to visit your website, and you can see on the bottom right there, we have a schedule a phone call button. The website visitor goes to your website, clicks on a button to schedule a phone call, and then they're going to walk through a process. You can see that depicted there on the top, where the consumer selects an appropriate time based on the contact center's availability. And at the time that they select, an available ready agent in the queue will call that person back. We support scheduled callback for both voice and video. You can select either or both of those options and embed that into your website using the Web SDK. Let's walk through, if you're a website developer, how do you embed the Web SDK into your website. It's really easy. You'll go to your Zoom Contact Center admin portal. We have a section called Campaign Management. From there, you'll click on the Embed Web tag. There's a single line of code, a single script tag. Copy that script tag, put it on the website. If you're the web developer, add it to your code. And that's all that you need to do to get started. The API key simply represents the particular Zoom account. And that single line of code is all you need to have to get started with all three of those examples: chat, video, and scheduled callback. Let's take a look at how you can customize the experience to meet your branding requirements. Here we can see how you can customize the invitation button. We call the invitation button the button that the consumer clicks on when they start a chat or a video or scheduled callback. We have two options. We have the embedded invitation and a sticky invitation. With a sticky invitation, you'll go to your Zoom Contact Center admin portal, which you can see here. You can control the color of the button, the words on the button, the icon on the button, the font that's used. And then the Zoom CX Web SDK will render the button on your website for you. As a web developer, if you prefer to render the button yourself, whether it's a button or a link, you'll use the embedded invitation option. With that option, you will create the button or the link or whatever you want the website visitor to click on. You will create that as the website developer, and the Zoom CX Web SDK will simply monitor for click events on the element that you can configure here. So in this example on the left, we have an element ID called Start ZCC Chat. You create an element on your website. When somebody clicks on that element, the Zoom CX Web SDK will start the web chat window. Now let's take a look at how you can customize the web chat window once the chat engagement starts. To do that, you'll go through the campaign engagement customization. Here's a screenshot of what that looks like for the contact center admin. This is just an example. We have a purple header bar, an icon here, some text on the top. You can control and configure most all aspects of this. You can see some of the options here on the left. You can control fonts and size and colors, and you can configure all of that from within your admin portal, and that will then be rendered on your website by the Web SDK. We have some additional optional programming aspects of the Web SDK that we call Campaign SDK. This allows you to programmatically interact between your website code and the Zoom CX Web SDK. Let's walk through some examples. So we have events that the Zoom CX Web SDK will emit to your website. When somebody clicks on a button, we'll emit the open event. When somebody closes it and completes it, we'll emit the close event. And you can see some others here. One that I really like is the support_handoff event. If you're using Zoom Virtual Agent and you configure some use cases where the Zoom Virtual Agent will not be able to complete the entire workflow, the Zoom Virtual Agent can detect that workflow, and the Web SDK will emit the support handoff event to your website. From there, you can listen to that event, and then you may take the person to an application or some other form on your website to continue the experience there. At the bottom are some APIs that you can call. The Open API will allow you to programmatically open up the chat engagement window, and you can see some other examples here. This section here in the screen is totally optional, but can help you create creative experiences for your website visitors. Other important aspects of the Web SDK and website integration with Zoom CX is to be able to pass data from your website into Zoom CX. And so you can do that by passing data from different parts of your web application, whether it's local storage, session storage, cookies, and you can see the other options here. How do you do that? On the right-hand side, what you will do is essentially map data from a particular part of your web application, which is at the bottom, from website data. In this example, we're going to pull data out of local storage, and specifically the key name, preferred name. We'll pull that data out of there and we'll store it at the top in the Zoom Contact Center global variable with the same name called preferred name. You can create as many variables as you would like to. You can create custom variables. You can map them so that you can do creative things like pass in information on shopping cart, what's in the shopping cart, or what product was somebody looking at when they started a chat. Or if you're, let's say you're an apartment complex company and you have 200 apartment complexes, you can know exactly what apartment complex somebody was looking at when they started a web chat. You can, as the web developer, you know what's important, you know where the data is stored in your web application. You can map it into Zoom CX, as you can see here. And then once that's completed, of course, the global variable has the data. And then from there, you can use it in self-service applications or display it to the agent. A purpose-built feature that we have is called consumer authentication. This is a fairly complex feature, but the purpose of this feature is to be able to identify who the person is on a web chat. We do this by having the person log into your web application. So Zoom is not involved in the authentication process. Once they're already logged in, you can create a consumer authentication endpoint on your web application. What you'll essentially do is sign a JWT with a private key. The Zoom CX Web SDK will call your endpoint. You'll sign that JWT with your private key and pass it back. And then that JWT will go into the Zoom CX cloud, where we will use the associated public key to validate that the JWT was signed. And that way we can ensure the authenticity of the data. So you create the private key, you give us the public key, and we'll use that to validate that the user has gone through this consumer authentication process. Let's take a look. We're going to walk through the steps configuration-wise, maybe help better understand how this works. Let's go through a 4-step process here. So the first step, you're going to build that authentication endpoint on your website. On the website, you'll create, this is what the response of that endpoint will look like. You're going to create a JSON response. We are going to look at the login user ID JWT field. And in that field is the signed JWT. This is what that looks like. Now we'll decode the signed JWT. This is an example of what it looks like. You can configure any JSON payload format you want. It doesn't have to look like this. Whatever data you want to pass back, you can put in this JSON response. In this example, you can see account number, account status, the email, and first name and last name of the person. After you've configured that endpoint on your website, then we'll go into the Zoom CX configuration. Step 2, can tell us what your consumer authentication endpoint is. That way the Web SDK knows where to go and get that data. Tell us what your public key is. We'll use that public key to make sure that your private key is what signed the JWT. And if your private key signed the JWT, we'll then extract the contents of the JWT. And again, using global variables, just like before, we'll map data from the signed JWT payload into a Zoom CX global variable. So in this example, we're pulling the email field out of the signed JWT, and we're storing it in the email global variable, which again can be used later in the flow or displayed to the agent. And the 4th step, that's a part of consumer authentication, is to validate that consumer authentication happens successfully. So to do that, in the 4th step, you're going to add into your flow a check, and you're going to check the value of the authentication status Boolean variable. If we validate the signed JWT was signed by the private key associated with the public key, we'll set the value of this Boolean variable to true. And then in your flow, you can take them through the flow process that you want to do when you know they've gone through consumer authentication. Okay, that's a lot for Web SDK. Let's go over and discuss mobile SDK. So with mobile SDK, this would be for any developers that have your own iPhone or Android application. And the use cases are similar for what we've just covered in Web SDK, web chat, video, for example. Now you're going to create your mobile application on iPhone or Android. You'll add buttons to your application. In this example, you see a start video call button. Again, just an example. We also have a chat button. You can add both of those buttons or just one or the other. Once somebody clicks on that button, then the Zoom CX mobile SDK will take over. I call this SDK a fairly turnkey SDK because all you need to do is put the buttons on your app, essentially creating entry points into the Zoom CX mobile SDK. Once you trigger your button to call the Zoom CX code, from there, the rest of the user interface experience is all handled by Zoom CX. So very easy to integrate into your mobile applications. Mobile application development is fairly specialized. So we have developer documentation on the Zoom developer site. You can see there on the left, this is an example of the Android developer documentation. We have some code examples. So if you're a mobile app developer, please check out more on developers.zoom.us. Now let's go into Smart Embed. So Smart Embed, again, this is the SDK targeted towards your contact center agents. You can see here that the contact center agent is using the Smart Embed, which you see on the right-hand side, embedded into your web application. Smart Embed supports voice channel, web chat channel, and the video channel. You'll create your website. You can embed Smart Embed for agents to log into Zoom CX right on your website. It's very easy to use. We'll handle the user interface for Smart Embed. How does Smart Embed work? Well, it's an iframe-based solution. So here's the iframe. It uses bidirectional post-message event-based exchange. What that means is essentially in the front end, we're passing data from the Smart Embed iframe to your parent website, and your parent website can also send events back to Smart Embed, all running in the front end of the agent's browser. What are some of the use cases? Well, we'll tell you when the call's ringing, you can screen pop it. We'll tell you when the call's answered, you can log it. We'll tell you when the call ends, we'll tell you the notes, we'll tell you the duration. You can take all those events that are being emitted from Smart Embed and embed it inside of your web application. You can also pull global variables, and you can see at the bottom, you can see some of those events there. This is documented on the developer site as well, including how all of these various events work. Now we're going to transition into Zoom apps. So you may be familiar with Zoom apps from other products, like with Zoom Meetings. We also announced Zoom apps for Zoom Phone in the keynote as well, and we have Zoom apps for Zoom Contact Center. This is the ability to embed a web application, your web application, inside of the Zoom CX agent desktop. Let's take a look at what it looks like for an agent. So here we can see the agent desktop again, and on the right-hand side, we see the agent is working on a Zoom app. How do we know it's a Zoom app? Well, on the far right, you can see two icons that are there. Those are two different Zoom apps available to the agent. The Zoom apps that display there are based on the contact center queue, so admins can decide whether different queues have different apps. Agents can click on those icons, and then it will surface a Zoom app, your Zoom app, here on the right-hand side of the agent's desktop. This is just an example Zoom app showing a CRM-like system. This is just an example mock-up here. Now, Zoom Apps SDK is a JavaScript SDK, and so similar to the Smart Embed, you're going to have events exchanged both directions on the front end of the agent's computer. We'll show you some examples of what that looks like and some of the objects that are part of that SDK. So how do you build a Zoom app for Contact Center? Let's take a look at that. So first off, you're going to create your web application, and you'll have to host your web application. So once you've created your web application, you've developed it with your HTML and CSS and your JavaScript framework, then you'll import the Zoom Apps JavaScript SDK into your web application, and you'll add code to interact with various events that are going to be emitted from the Zoom Apps SDK. We'll walk through those examples. And finally, in the fourth step, you'll create a Zoom app. You'll create that Zoom app on the Zoom app marketplace, and by doing that, that's what's going to render the application inside of the Zoom workplace client. You're still going to host the web app, but now it'll be rendered inside of the client for the agent. Now, there's two types of ways that you can create Zoom apps. Let's take a look at those two types of apps. We have public Zoom apps. Now, public Zoom apps are available on marketplace.zoom.us. Any Zoom customer can search for and install your public Zoom app. To have a public Zoom app, you have to go through the app developer process, where the Zoom app marketplace review team will review your application. And because of that, public Zoom apps are targeted towards external development and third-party use cases. We also have private apps. So private apps are not listed publicly on Zoom Marketplace. They can only be installed on the Zoom account that created the app. And because of that, the app does not need to be reviewed or approved by the Zoom App Marketplace team. And therefore, private Zoom apps are targeted towards internal use cases. So if you're an internal developer, you'll be creating a private Zoom app. And if you're an ISV partner, you're going to likely create a public Zoom app. Let's take a look at some of the SDK functionality for Zoom apps. So Zoom apps, again, you can develop a Zoom app for Zoom Contact Center. You can also develop a Zoom app for Zoom Phone and a Zoom app for Zoom Meeting. And you can develop one app that works with all three products, or just one product. It's totally up to you. The Zoom Apps SDK has two core objects that you'll need to consider and develop into your application. The first is app context. The app context is going to provide you a set of parameters, and most importantly, will include the user ID of the user that's using your application, so you know who they are. The running context is also very important. It's going to tell you where the user is using your application. If you create an app for Contact Center and Zoom Phone and Zoom Meeting, you probably need to know, is the user accessing that app in Contact Center or in Phone or in Meeting, because you might render your application differently. So when your application loads, you can call the running context. And if it tells you that the value is in Contact Center, then you know that the user is a Contact Center agent and they're accessing your application inside of a Contact Center engagement. On the right side of the screen here is a screenshot of the Zoom Apps SDK, and it goes through all of these objects and more, and some links that we'll share at the end of the session. Now, these two are objects that are available for the entire Zoom Apps platform. Let's go to the next slide and talk about two objects specific to Zoom Contact Center. So the two objects specific to Zoom Contact Center for Zoom Apps are engagement context and engagement status. And if you're building a Zoom Contact Center compatible Zoom app, you're going to need to use both objects. Engagement context is going to tell you what is the agent looking at. They might be multitasking, multiple chats. Engagement context will tell you what they're doing right now because the agent can only look at one chat at a time, but they can switch back and forth. It will also tell you, was the engagement transferred? What queue was it delivered to? The engagement status has really important information as well. Most importantly, probably is who is the consumer? If it's a voice call, what's the consumer's telephone number? If it's a web chat or video, what's the consumer's email? That way you can look that up and screen pop within your application or do whatever your application needs to do with that information. Engagement status will also tell you whether it's a voice call, a video call, a messaging call, and it will tell you the life cycle. So is it an active engagement? Is the agent still on the phone? Or is it in wrap-up? Is the agent finishing their notes and selecting a disposition? Or has it ended? So you'll need to call both of these objects and pull the data from both of these objects into your Zoom Contact Center compatible Zoom application. This is a really important slide for anyone developing a Zoom Contact Center compatible Zoom app. Let's walk through the sequence diagram and talk about how you'll develop your Zoom app to be ZCC aware. So first off, let's discuss what we're looking at in the diagram. So on the top right is App A. App A is going to represent your Zoom app. Think of that as your Zoom app's web view instance running inside of the Zoom Workplace client. On the left at the top is Zoom Client Engagement 1 and Engagement 2. This could be one web chat, this could be another web chat or an SMS. Agents can multitask multiple and switch back and forth. While agents can switch back and forth between multiple engagements, you're going to have only one web view instance to support both of those engagements. So let's walk through how this would work in this sequence diagram. So the agent has both of these active engagements running, and the agent clicks on engagement 1. From there, your web view instance is going to launch if it wasn't launched already. When your web view instance launches and your app is running, you're going to call get engagement context and get engagement status because you want to know information about that engagement. If anything changes in that engagement, like maybe the agent went into wrap up, you're going to receive an on engagement status change event, letting you know that that engagement is now in wrap up and you can take that information and do something accordingly in your application. Now, let's say while that engagement is in wrap up, that engagement 2, the agent wants to go to engagement 2. The agent clicks on that SMS engagement, and now you're going to receive an on engagement context change telling you that now the agent is looking at engagement 2. You'll need to update your web view instance to match what should be appropriate with regards to engagement 2. And you can see the other events that will happen throughout the course of that. The agent may go back to engagement 1. You'll receive another on engagement context change event, letting you know that now the agent's back on engagement 1. Maybe update your app. You'll need to have some state where you can go back to what the agent was doing when they were on engagement 1 up here previously. And one last part that you'll want to consider during app development is when the agent is finally done, when they finish the call, complete their notes, select their disposition, and end the call, you're going to receive an on engagement status change event telling you the call is ended. When the call ends, the agent can no longer see that engagement on their desktop client, and they can no longer see your web view instance. Your web view instance is still running. You can still process that event, but the agent doesn't see it. So during training, make sure that agents complete all tasks prior to completing engagements. Now let's talk about some of our REST APIs and data that's available via WebSockets and webhook events that you can use to receive information from the Zoom CX platform. I'll categorize them into two categories. User provisioning, right? Onboarding new agents, giving them skills, putting them in queues. System provisioning, adding address book entries, changing variables, changing the value of variables, pulling data out of the platform, pulling recording data, transcripts, logs, historical data. You can pull that data out of those APIs. If you have your own proprietary knowledge-based system, you can use APIs and push that data into Zoom CX. So it's available for AI chatbot and our AI expert assist. Our webhooks and WebSockets are going to send you a real-time stream of information, raw data events that tell you exactly what's happening in the contact center. 3 areas that you could receive: engage in webhooks, the agent's phone rang, the agent answered, the agent transferred, recording started, recording stopped, consumer events, a consumer hung up. You can receive agent events or user events. Agent logged in, agent logged out, agent went ready, not ready. Agent opted out of a queue, opted in of a queue. And you can receive configuration events. If configuration changes by another administrator, you can receive an event letting you know that something has changed. I know we've covered a lot in today's session. Wanted to provide a fairly comprehensive overview of everything Zoom CX. So we wanted to share some links here of where you can go and find more information should you be interested to learn about more things related to Zoom apps or the Zoom CX SDKs that we discussed, as well as our API references as well. So thanks a lot for joining this session. Appreciate everyone showing interest in Zoom CX and joining the session today. And please join other sessions as part of the Zoom Developer Summit. Thank you all very much and hope everyone has a nice day.